All right. I believe that everyone is in so far. Um, and so I'm just going to get us started today. So I will say, if you could hold off on any questions until the very end, or you can put them in chat if you want to just jot them down before or before you forget about it. So just so that it's there. That is totally fine. And then at the very end, I'll be answering questions. So hopefully you can all see my screen. So today's training is going to be floodplain management basics for New Hampshire community officials. And I am Sarah Thunberg, the one of the two state floodplain management coordinators. Stephanie Frechette is also my coworker. She is um, another one of our NFIP coordinators, um, and will hopefully be on here uh, later. But so I'm going to start off with our agenda for today. So we're going to be talking about the National Flood Insurance Program and just kind of an overview of it, and then go on to some floodplain mapping, talk about flood insurance, and then um, talk about some of the community floodplain regulations and some of the minimum requirements that are needed in your zoning ordinance, and then give you guys some or wrap up with some resources. And these slides will be sent out to everyone here at the end. So feel free, if you guys will have all of the links to any of the URLs that I will be sharing today. So don't feel like you have to jot it down really quickly. So what is the National Flood Insurance Program? Um, so uh, real quick, sorry, we got a couple people I need to admit. Okay, there we go. Um, so the National Flood Insurance Program was created by Congress in 1968. It is a voluntary partnership between FEMA and communities. Um, and the communities essentially agree to participate in the program, although it's not required. We do have very good participation in New Hampshire. Um, and Um, so generally, when we're talking about the NFIP, we refer to it as a three-legged stool with three main aspects of the program. There's floodplain mapping, regulations, and flood insurance. So a participating community agrees to adopt local floodplain regulations and enforce them through a local permitting process. And those regulations are determined by FEMA. They have minimum requirements to be participating within the National Flood Insurance Program. And once a community agrees to adopt those regulations in their zoning ordinance, then flood insurance is available through FEMA for all homeowners and residents in that community, regardless if they're in the floodplain or not. Anyone can buy flood insurance if the community is participating. Um, so in New Hampshire, we have really great participation. We have 220 communities, which is about 94% participation in the state. This map right here shows our current participating communities in white. These gray areas are unincorporated places. And then some of these red towns are not participating, and we have a couple that were participating at one point, but then are no longer participating in the program. Also, if everybody could mute yourselves, that would be wonderful. While I'm presenting, I'm not able to do that on my end. Um, that'd be great. So there are different roles that FEMA, the state, and communities have within the NFIP. So some of the roles that FEMA has are to make flood insurance. Hold on, sorry, I need to pause for a second and mute some people. We're getting a little bit of feedback. All right. So FEMA makes flood insurance available for participating communities, and they also provide the flood insurance maps that communities agree to enforce their regulations on. They also are the overarching or the overseeing entity for the National Flood Insurance Program. They establish development and building standards and guidance, and they monitor compliance. Okay. So then the state's role with the National Flood Insurance Program is to essentially be the go-between between communities and FEMA, because FEMA can be almost like reading a textbook. It's very legalese language, sometimes difficult to understand and interpret how these regulations will apply at the community level. And so that's what we do here at the state. We provide technical assistance to all stakeholders, whether that's homeowners, community officials, engineers, anyone who would be involved with development in the floodplain or regulations, anything like that. We additionally have education and outreach, such as these trainings that we're hosting today. We also have some resources on our website, such as model floodplain regulations and um, different resources on like guidance documents from FEMA. We also assist communities in evaluating compliance of the floodplain activities and also help out during post-disaster activities, such as substantial damage determinations. So for community responsibilities, it's firstly important to understand your community's floodplain regulations and understand how to use the FEMA maps. And this is what we're going to be covering later on today in more detail. And a participating community is also responsible to ensure that permits are applied for and issued for all development within the special flood hazard area, and to also make sure that all development is meeting the community's floodplain regulations. And if not, then the community is responsible to take enforcement actions and correct those violations. So we're going to start off by talking about the floodplain mapping side of things. So first off, where can you view the maps? How do you know what you're looking at? So communities are generally should have paper copies of the maps, but then we also there's several different websites that you can go to look at these maps. One of them is the Map Service Center, msc.fema.gov. That is going to be the most detailed and have all of the flood insurance studies, flood reports, and any letter of map amendments or letter of map changes that have been issued for amendments to the maps. So that can all be found at the Map Service Center through FEMA. Then FEMA also has what's called the Flood Map Changes Viewer. That will overlay the new preliminary maps that are currently in the works on top of the existing maps, so you can see which areas have been removed, which areas have been added to the floodplain, and see the new definition with better surveying tools. New Hampshire also has our own flood hazards viewer. It's almost identical to FEMA's flood hazards viewer, except we have the community layer on it, so you can actually see your town boundaries. There's also the New Hampshire Granite view, and if you want, and if your community has your own GIS mapping software, you can download the GIS data through the FEMA's Map Service Center um, and map it in your own software. So what does the Map Service Center look like? So if you go to msc.fema.gov, this is what you're going to be looking at. You're going to see this search bar where you can enter in your either address or latitude and longitude coordinate, and it will take you to a little map. It's bigger than this. This is just a little thumbnail for to preview what you would be seeing with the Map Service Centers. So the New Hampshire Flood Hazards Viewer looks almost identical to the FEMA Flood Hazards Viewer. Right here, I have a screenshot of the City of Concord's floodplain maps. So we'll go over what all of these different zones mean later. But as you can see, it's very detailed. There's specific areas within the floodplain that have different risks associated with it. So the FEMA Flood Map Changes Viewer is something that if your community is currently undergoing a new mapping process, this would be something that would be good to look at. So this right here is a screenshot of the current effective maps. This is over in Antrim, and so you can see there is an area of the floodplain up here, and then also along the river. And if I toggle over to the, this is the preliminary map. So I'm going to kind of go back and forth a little bit, just so you can see the difference between these maps, especially if you look up on the north side of the map. You can see that the new map is showing a lot more detail in the floodplain boundary. So another thing that you can see on the flood map changes viewer is areas that have been removed from the floodplain. So all of this purple area is actually getting removed from the floodplain. So anyone that had a flood insurance policy in that area will have the opportunity to not have that policy, not pay for that policy anymore if they choose. They can also keep the policy if they want. Then it also shows areas where the floodplain has increased or just shifted, and that is shown in the hatched yellow here. So the official floodplain maps are referred to as the flood insurance rate maps, and they are also accompanied with the flood insurance study and report. So this is an example of one of the older floodplain or flood insurance rate maps. I'm going to call them firms just for ease of speaking from now on. And this is an example right here of some of the new maps, and you can see that it's a lot more detailed. It has better satellite data, and it's a little bit more accurate and showing new roads and things. So what are the flood insurance rate maps and FIS reports used for? So they are primarily, they're produced by FEMA and then used by municipal officials to either determine which areas of their community are subject to the floodplain development regulations and also the building requirements that apply for development in different areas within the floodplain. Mortgage lenders also use these floodplain maps to determine which properties require flood insurance as a condition of their mortgage or loan. And then they're also used by the general public to understand the flood risk in their area. So what is actually shown on these maps? So what we commonly call the floodplain is technically called the 1% annual chance flood. So that is the area that would be covered by water during a 100-year flooding event. It is sometimes called the base flood or the 100-year flood because statistically you would see a flood like this once every 100 years. Now that does not mean that once every 100 years there will be one of these floods, or every 100 years there will only be one of these floods. You can have 100-year floods in back-to-back years or within the same year, depending on how the weather patterns happen. This is just a statistical number. So the 1% annual chance flood area shown on the firm is also called the special flood hazard area. In your zoning ordinance, you're typically going to see this referred to as the special flood hazard area, or SFHA. So let's actually look at some maps right now. So there's many different zones within the floodplain. And generally they're going to start with either the letter A or V. A is inland and V is coastal. And then areas outside the special flood hazard area are designated as Zone X. So I've got a couple, this map right here shows many different flood zones. So we have Zone A, Zone AE, Zone AO, and Zone VE, all shown on this map. So what do those mean? Zone AE is the most common floodplain designation in New Hampshire. It is inland floodplain, which includes a base flood elevation. And it also may include a floodway along rivers and streams. Now, the base flood elevation is essentially just elevation data showing how high geographically that water will be at the 100-year flood. Now, not every floodplain has been mapped to that amount of detail, and so there are many Zone A's in New Hampshire, which is kind of just an approximation of the floodplain, but it does not have any elevation data to show how high that water would actually be. Then there are some areas called Zone AO, which is typically found like behind a sand dune on a beach, where there's during the 100-year flooding event, that area will have what's referred to as shallow flooding, and the floodwaters will kind of overtop some sand dunes or a levee or whatever kind of barrier berm is in the area, and then it will pool to a depth between 1 to 3 feet. And on your Zone AOs, typically it does indicate exactly whether it's 1, 2, or 3 feet. Then there's also the coastal high hazard area that's called Zone VE. This is affected by waves higher than 3 feet. And those zones do include base flood elevations. So the base flood elevations shown on the maps are always rounded to the nearest whole foot. There is more detailed data in the flood insurance study that goes to the nearest tenth of a foot. That should be used for any elevation certificates, but for just general approximation, the whole foot is reasonable enough. So the base flood elevation shows the height to which floodwater would be expected to rise in the 1% annual chance flood event. This is not a flood depth because that is only during the 1% annual chance flood event. So like if you have something that would be more considered a 50-year flood, the base flood elevation would not be indicating the depth of that water. So another portion of the floodplain that you will commonly see along rivers is called the regulatory floodway. This is the area that will experience the highest amount and fastest flowing water during the 100-year flood event. So the main hazard with this is the velocity of the water. It is flowing very fast, and the floodway is typically reserved for it. Most communities do not allow any development at all within the floodway because that area really needs to be reserved to make sure that if that 100-year flood does come, there is no obstruction to clear that floodwater away. So in our coastal areas, there is a distinction between your coastal and your inland areas, and that is what we call the limit of moderate wave action, or LIMWA. It is the boundary of what we call the coastal A zone. It is the inland limit of the area expected to receive 1.5 feet or higher of breaking waves during the 1% annual chance flood. And this area from the limit of moderate wave action and coastal or seaward, there we go, does have special building requirements that apply per the state building code. So along with the flood insurance rate maps, there is something called the flood insurance study. This is a very detailed report about the flood analysis that are used to prepare the maps. It also includes important tables and charts that include base flood elevation information. So what do community officials need to know to use these flood maps? Or why do community officials need to know how to use them? So your community floodplain regulations apply to all lands that are designated as special flood hazard areas on these maps. That is part of the agreement to participate. You agree that our communities agree that these flood insurance rate maps are the legal maps that they will use to determine if properties are in the floodplain and to also determine which floodplain development regulations apply. And these floodplain maps have different zones, which have different building requirements, such as the floodway, which typically allows no development, whereas the depending on which community, some communities do allow some development within the floodplain, but not within the floodway. Some communities prohibit development in all of the floodplain, and those regulations are really determined by or at the community level, and they're different from community to community. And the community is ultimately the one responsible for the final determination on whether or not a property is in the floodplain and if a community will regulate it according to the floodplain regulations. So we have some ongoing mapping in the state of New Hampshire. FEMA is in the process of updating all of the floodplain maps across the state. There is one watershed that has already gone effective last year. That was the Pemigewasset watershed in Grafton County. And then we have pretty much the rest of the state within the next 2 or 3 years will be seeing a new floodplain map. And that is because FEMA updates these maps every decade or so to capture any new development, new bridges, changes in the waterway, or just changes in the weather patterns, because these rivers are not static and stagnant. So we have many different watersheds within the state of New Hampshire, and each of these has a mapping project associated with it. There is a current New Hampshire floodplain mapping activities on our website that you can check out to see what the status is of your watershed. But really quickly, I pulled this yesterday. So this is essentially a map of the expected date for what's called the letter of final determination. And that is the point where your community will actually need to adopt the new floodplain maps. So the areas in yellow here, we've got portions of Hillsborough County, Merrimack, and Rockingham County that are expected to need to adopt the new maps this year. Next year, we have some more areas of southern New Hampshire and the Lakes region. And then 2027 is when the North Country is expecting to see their new maps, as well as coastal Rockingham and southern or eastern Hillsborough County. And then the watershed over, I believe this is the Black Watakichi watershed. It has been pushed back, and these dates are going to fluctuate. This is not, you should plan on these maps, but also plan that these dates will probably change depending on any holdups within the map or that occurred during the mapping process. All right, so I'm going to move on to how to actually determine what your base flood elevation is, because that is something that community officials need to know, because there are zoning regulations that require all development within the floodplain to be at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So first off, you need to make sure you're working on the same vertical coordinates. So the depending on when maps were made, if your community has essentially the original maps and has not had new maps issued yet, you might be working under the National Geodetic Vertical Datum from 1929, or the North American Vertical Datum from 1988. And if you are trying to compare the elevation of a lowest floor to the base flood elevation, just double check that you know which vertical datum is being used, and just make sure you're comparing apples to apples. All right, so how you determine the base flood elevation is going to vary depending on which flood zone the property that you're looking at is located in. So for most AE zones, the flood insurance study report is going to include more precise base flood elevation data than what's on the map. Because like I said earlier, the map only shows the base flood to the nearest whole foot, whereas the flood insurance study goes to the nearest 1/10 of a foot. And if you are trying to issue an elevation certificate or a certificate of occupancy, you want to make sure that you're comparing it to the most accurate data that you have. So the flood insurance study also has a couple other data tables to get more precise base flood elevation data. So if there is a still water, or lakes, ponds, and some coastal areas have what's called a still water elevation table, and that is going to be in the flood insurance study. It also has flood profiles, which is essentially the height of the base flood elevation along the distance of a river. Then there's also the floodway data table that it literally just has cross sections across the river and then corresponding heights for that base flood elevation. We're going to start with the easiest and then work our way up to the hardest. So starting with zone A, as I said earlier, there is no base flood elevation for these zones. So that can create a bit of a complicated situation. So depending on if your community regulations are really going to determine how you're going to move forward to determine the base flood elevation for these areas. So if there was a locally or state funded floodplain study, you can use that data or any other surveying data to try to get a base flood elevation. You can also use historic flood data, such as high water marks. Otherwise, you can also just say that the base flood elevation is going to be 2 feet above the highest adjacent grade of the building site. And typically that is what we recommend in our state model floodplain ordinance for communities, just to make sure that there is a rule that will cover all bases. All right, so AO zones is also pretty easy to figure out what the base flood elevation is. So your AO zone is going to specify the depth of that floodwater. And to determine your base flood elevation, all you're going to want to do is take the highest adjacent grade of the building, add the depth that you see on the AO depth here, and then just add those together, and that's going to be your base flood elevation. So simple as that for AO zones. VE zones are pretty easy as well. The coastal high hazard area, it just has the elevation right there. So you're just going to read off the map for what your base flood elevation is for these VE zones. All right, now in that area along the coast, but it's transitioned over to AE zones, you want to check between the map and then also the flood insurance study, because sometimes for those coastal AE zones, depending on the high water, it might be different. So look up the BFE on the map and then also use the flood insurance study report. And then whichever of those two is the higher, you're going to want to use that. FEMA has a nice little introduction to coastal flood mapping that can be helpful if you're in a community that has these areas. All right, so the ponds, lakes, anything that has a still water elevation, you are going to want to look at the flood insurance study, because it will have what's called a table summary of still water elevations. So as you can see on the map here, this elevation is rounded to the nearest whole foot. But if you go to the still water elevation table, you can see it goes down to the nearest 1/10 of a foot. And you want to always use the most accurate data that you have. All right, so moving on to some more complicated BFE determinations. So if you are looking at a property that is right on the outskirts of a river, I'm going to start with the easier of the scenarios. It is sitting on a cross section across the river. So this is cross section AL. And so this is a nice situation where you can just go over to the flood insurance study table and look at the floodway data tables, go over to the cross section AL, and look at your base flood elevation. In this case, it is 196.4 feet. But what if you have a property that is not perfectly lined up with a cross section? Well, this is going to take a little bit of math or graph reading, really. So the floodplain map is going to have a scale on it, and you're actually going to want to take the scale and measure the distance using the scale to the closest cross section. And then you're going to go over to the flood profile. So this shows distance going up the river, and then this is elevation. So you've got several different lines here. You have the stream bed, 100-year flood, 50, or 10-year flood, 50, 100, and 500-year flood. So to look up the base flood elevation, you're always going to want to use the 100-year flood for that. So you're going to find the closest cross section, off or go over, however, whatever distance you've measured on the map, go up to the 100-year flood elevation, and then go over and read your elevation there, and then that will be your base flood elevation. So that's how you find base flood elevation for all of the different flood zones that we have in the state of New Hampshire. So now let's talk about insurance. Now, over the last couple of years, we've had a lot of flooding, whether it's coastal winter flooding or summer flash flood from thunderstorms. So New Hampshire is well aware that anywhere it can rain, it can flood, even if you're on top of a hill. So for most private flood insurance, generally you have to be in the floodplain to purchase the insurance. But through the National Flood Insurance Program, any resident or business owner is eligible to purchase flood insurance as long as they're in a participating community. And flood insurance is a good idea because your home and renter's insurance typically does not cover any flooding damage. Additionally, flood insurance is going to pay for damages regardless of if there's a presidential disaster declaration or not. So it's going to capture even those just nuisance floods. If you get a little bit of damage, like if the end of your driveway washes out, you can file a claim and get money to get a new culvert and new paving. And the flood insurance or National Flood Insurance Program also covers damages that are not necessarily flood related. So there is an aspect where if a house is what's called substantially damaged, meaning it's been damaged by more than half its market value. And that damages can be caused from a tree falling on your house or a fire or a flood. But regardless, the National Flood Insurance Program is going to pay to fix up that house, regardless of what that damage is. As long as it was substantially damaged, you can use the flood insurance to get some payment for that. So there are times when flood insurance is required and there's times when it's not. And generally, flood insurance is required if you have a federally backed mortgage and the property is in the floodplain. That's going to be a condition of the mortgage. And your lending institution is going to use the FEMA flood maps to identify if that property is in the special flood hazard area or not. And then it's the responsibility of the lender or someone working for the lender to make that determination. So if flood insurance would be required, if the determination is made that the property is in the floodplain, then flood insurance is going to be required for the life of that loan. And then once the loan is paid off, the property owner has the choice to either continue flood insurance or to stop having that policy. So one thing to remember is that even though we're talking about flood insurance, your company's or communities' floodplain regulations are going to apply regardless of if a property has flood insurance. So even if someone decides to pay for their house out of pocket, they still have to build it to at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. Otherwise, that property would be in violation. So what does the insurance look like, or flood insurance look like in New Hampshire? So we have a total of 7,634 policies. Now that varies greatly from community to community. I can tell you Hampton has about 2,000 of those policies, whereas somewhere other communities only have 2 policies. So it really varies depending on how much or what the extent of your floodplain is in your community. So we have $1.9 billion essentially of coverage annually through the state of New Hampshire, and then that adds up to a premium of $8.4 billion or million dollars. All right, so if you are new to floodplain management, you might not be aware, but FEMA within the last few years has actually changed the way that the flood insurance is rated, and how the premiums are determined. So it's actually making it more fair and actuarially sound. And that is because FEMA is using a bunch of different determinations to figure out what that premium should be. So FEMA is going to look at where a property is built, its distance to coasts, oceans, rivers, lakes. It's going to look at the ground elevation and how high the property is compared to nearby flooding sources. It's also going to look at which community the property is located in and whether or not that community has higher than the minimum building standards. FEMA is also going to look at how the building is built. It's going to look at your foundation type, first floor height, the number of floors, whether or not you're looking at a first floor apartment or a 6th floor apartment. Construction type, if you're looking at a brick building or a wood building, if there's any flood openings, and then also where your utilities are, if your utilities are in the basement or the first floor or up in the attic, and all of that adds up to a different risk. And then lastly, FEMA is going to look at what is being covered. If you're covering a single family home, an apartment complex, a mall, or a hospital, all of those are different uses, different contents, and different risks associated with the building. And FEMA is going to assemble all of that, take in all of that information, and determine a unique policy premium for that structure itself. And so it's more, so if you have a new house and your neighbor has a 100-year-old house, your premiums are probably going to be looking very different, even though you have essentially the same flood risk due to location, but different risk due to construction. So for those of you that are more familiar, have experience with the program, so what's new with this new risk rating 2.0 is what FEMA's calling it. So FEMA has a risk rating engine that is kind of reducing some of the complexity of the quote process. It has eliminated the requirement for an elevation certificate. It's expanding the mitigation discounts, expanding CRS discounts, and phasing out the preferred risk policy. But what is not changing? So use of the flood insurance rate maps for community floodplain management, that's not going away. That's still staying. The requirement for flood insurance as a condition of a mortgage, that's still staying. Also, the letter of map change process is staying the same. Now, what does this mean for floodplain administrators? So the flood insurance rate maps are still going to be used for the purpose of floodplain management and planning. And the risk rating risk rating variables should be considered to help lower policy premiums for future home buyers and current property owners. If you want some more information on the risk rating 2.0, we have some resources on our website as well as some FEMA resources here. And again, you are going to get these slides after the presentation today, so don't feel like you need to write down this URL right now. All right, so we're going to move on to floodplain regulations. So as I said, I've said many times today, the part of the community's participation within the NFIP is to agree to adopt and enforce at least the minimum NFIP requirements. So enforcement of the floodplain regulations helps communities to minimize future flood damage, keeps people and property safe, and it also keeps insurance rates affordable for property owners. So these floodplain regulations are local regulations. The community decides which, whether or not they want to just have the minimum NFIP regulations or go above and beyond and participate in the community rating system, which rewards communities for adopting higher than the minimum floodplain standards. So in New Hampshire, we have basic model ordinances that have the minimum NFIP requirements to model your zoning ordinance after. And they are dependent on which flood zones you have in your community. So if you are looking for a model ordinance, email me and I will look at your community and give you the correct model ordinance for your community. And then lastly, it is up to the community to take full ownership of their floodplain regulations by fully understanding and enforcing the requirements as that it contains. So the minimum NFIP regulations are a great start, but buildings can still suffer damage. The minimum regulations do not address changes to the floodplain maps since the maps were issued. They don't address events greater than the 1% annual chance flood, don't address future changes. They are a static image or a static capturing of the current events of when the maps were issued. So we have what's called a higher floodplain regulation standard, or a menu of higher floodplain standards in New Hampshire. And it's essentially just a list of things that you can add to your zoning ordinance to essentially increase resiliency in the floodplain in your community. You can, one of the things is to require buildings to be at least 2 feet above the base flood elevation or up to 3 feet. And some communities have, so the minimum NFIP regulations require the buildings to be at least as high as the base flood elevation. In New Hampshire, we have a higher standard in our state building code that requires at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. But if your community wants to be even more resilient, you can increase that to 2 or 3 feet. So the flood provisions in the state building code are a good start, but they don't, they essentially just only include the minimum standards. And it's generally a good idea to try to think of some higher standards that you can incorporate into your floodplain management regulations. So what does some of the specific requirements are so all proposed development in the special flood hazard area requires a local permit. Some communities will have this incorporated in the building permit. Some communities have a standalone floodplain development permit too. And these are because so floodplain development will include many different activities that are not always incorporated within the building permit. These can be drilling, storage of equipment or materials, dredging, filling, paving, mining, in addition to just your typical building construction. So it's always a good idea because sometimes building permits can miss some of these other development that is going to need to be regulated within the floodplain. And so having a standalone floodplain development ordinance or building floodplain development permit, having a standalone permit is a good idea to make sure that you're capturing all of these types of development. So community's permitting process for floodplain development should include, first off, a process to determine whether the development is located in the special flood hazard area or not. The community needs to make this decision to know which portions of their floodplain regulations are going to apply to this property. Secondly, if a permit is required, the permit application detailing with the project details is required so that the community can determine what kind of regulations are going to apply. And then third, a community needs to have a process to ensure, ideally during construction, but at the very least, once the proposed development is completed, that there is a process to ensure that the development complies with the community's floodplain regulations. And this is for any new or substantially improved structures. The community is required to obtain as-built elevation data, review it for compliance, and then maintain it on file. And lastly, if development is found to not meet the community's floodplain regulations, the community must follow their enforcement process, just like any other zoning violation, to address the noncompliance. So to help communities document these permitting processes, our office has developed a fact sheet called the Guidance for Best Practices for an Effective Local Floodplain Management Program. This document provides guidance to communities on who and what should be involved in each process. And to accompany the guidance document, we also have we've developed a sample floodplain development administrative procedures for local communities. to adopt. And we have both a coastal and a non-coastal version. And the purpose of these procedures is to ensure that communities adhere to their regulations and to maintain consistency when there's new staff, to remain in good standing with the National Flood Insurance Program. If your community already has good administrative procedures, it is still recommended that they're written down in a standard operating procedure or something similar, because if we know that there's a lot of staff turnover in these small communities, and just making sure that those procedures are written down is a good way to make sure that all of the permitting is consistent. So another requirement in the community's floodplain ordinance is that the applicant must have all of the other required permits, whether it's state or federal or local permits, before the floodplain development is granted. And your building inspector, whoever is the local floodplain manager, should know the applicable federal and state regulatory programs. So some general construction requirements in the floodplain ordinance. So first off, development has to be designed or modified and adequately anchored to prevent flotation, collapse, and lateral movement. It also has to be constructed with flood-resistant materials and use methods and practices to minimize flood damage. FEMA has some guidance documents on each of these to help community officials and engineers make sure that the construction and development is fully compliant. So floodplain ordinances also include requirements for utility and mechanical regulations. So the best practice is to require in the ordinance that utilities be elevated to at least the base flood elevation, especially if the communities require the lowest floor of the structure to be above the base flood elevation. And then the ordinance should also detail the requirements for new or replacement of water and sewer systems, including septic. So new construction or substantial improvement of a structure at minimum requires elevation of the lowest floor to be at least the NFIP requirements are to be at least as high as the base flood elevation. New Hampshire State Building Code requires the lowest floor to be elevated to at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. And this applies for all the development in zones A, all of the A zones, is whether it's A, AE, or AO. Now, coastal high hazard area, or zone BE, the regulation is for buildings to be elevated on pilings and columns. And that is because with the coastal high hazard area, you're going to be having that wave action, and you want to make sure that that wave is able to go through the bottom of the structure and not have a lot of force going up against a solid foundation. So development in zone A with no BFE. So it is really up to the communities themselves to determine how they want to handle this. It is recommended that communities require the lowest floor to be elevated at least 2 feet above the highest adjacent grade. We have that in our state model ordinance, and that is generally best practice for dealing with Zone A. Now, enclosures below the lowest floor, aka basement or not a basement. So enclosures below the lowest floor are allowed, but they must be either used solely for parking, storage, building access, or not be below grade on all sides. And they have to meet NFIP requirements related to flood openings. That essentially means that for every square foot of space in that below grade area, there has to be an equal amount of square inch of openings in the foundation to allow the floodwaters to come in. And that is because during the 100-year flood, if you're going to have water coming up 5 feet up your foundation, you don't want your basement to be empty, because all of that pressure from that water pushing on the foundation is going to crumble the foundation, and then your house is going to fall into the basement if there's no water on the inside of the basement to press against it. And so that's what these flood openings are for. It's to make sure that that pressure gets equalized so that your foundation doesn't crumble. All right. So in coastal high hazard area, the enclosures below the lowest floor have to be free of obstructions, constructed with non-supporting breakaway walls, open lattice work, or insect screening. And they can only be used for parking, building access, or storage. So what exactly is considered a basement? So this is any area of a building that has its floor below grade on all sides. And it doesn't matter how deep that is. So you could be thinking that it's a crawl space, but if it is below floor or below grade on all sides, then that is going to be called the lowest floor and a basement, even if it's a 2-foot crawl space. So basements for new construction or substantial improvements that are in the special flood hazard area are not allowed. Just not allowed. The only way you're going to get around that is through flood openings and enclosures, or changing that use to only storage, or parking, or like opening it up so that it's not below grade on all sides. FEMA has some it's called Technical Bulletin 1. It is a guidance document on requirements for flood openings, and it's got a bunch of engineering resources on how to do that. So non-residential structures have the option to, if they have an area that is below the base flood elevation, they have the option to either elevate that lowest floor to or above the base flood elevation, or floodproof, essentially making the building watertight. That includes adding like slats in the doors to block the floodwaters, also constructing it out of floodproof materials, up to or above the base flood elevation. And then again, the New Hampshire State Building Code requires the lowest floor to be elevated to 1 to 2 feet above the base flood elevation, depending on the use of the building. Critical facilities such as hospitals are going to have to be 2 feet above the base flood elevation, just because to build in that extra resiliency, since it is a critical facility. So after the construction is done, communities are encouraged to obtain as-built elevation data. And it is, so this can be through a couple different things. It could be through what's called an elevation certificate. Generally, elevation certificates are recommended for all development in the floodplain. And that essentially just, it's a legal document that a surveyor or an engineer has stamped and put their license behind that says the lowest floor of this house is this high. And if there is any discrepancy or disagreement about that, or if for some reason this goes to court, the elevation certificate is going to be the legal document that is going to be referred back to. So it's always a good idea as a community to have those elevation certificates in your back pocket in case there's any disagreement about whether or not this building was permitted correctly or not. There's also something called a flood proofing certificate that is for non-residential structures, saying that they have been flood proofed to the, or above the base flood elevation and are compliant with the NFIP regulations. So you've heard me talk about substantial improvement a couple times. So essentially, you have buildings that existed before the FEMA made the floodplain maps. And those buildings were grandfathered into the program. They were not required to come into compliance. But these buildings are susceptible to damage or improvement. So the way that we are able to bring those old structures into compliance is through substantial improvement or substantial damage. Substantial improvement is when either you build you build onto the existing footprint or have an addition, but the construction cost is greater than or equal to half of the market value of the structure. And so when that is the case, the whole building has to come into compliance with the community's floodplain regulations, essentially meaning no basement if it's in the floodplain. It has to be at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation, and all of the other requirements. Substantial damage is pretty similar. And used similarly to substantial improvement. Essentially, if the construction costs to repair a building, or if a building has been damaged by more than half of its market value, then that building is going to need to come into full compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program. So communities have to be aware when development is kind of starting to get to that threshold of half of the market value, because the determination has to be made by the community. You have to review all proposed costs for all the improvements and repairs submitted by the applicant, and then determine the market value of the structure only, not the land, just the structure. And if it is determined that the building is substantially improved or damaged, the structure must be brought into compliance with the community's floodplain regulations as if it is a new construction. There are some resources that we have on our website. There's a substantial improvement and damage application packet, property owner guide to requirements, yeah. So we have these documents on our website. There you go. So then some other miscellaneous requirements that your community might have in the floodplain ordinance. So if your community has a floodway, Typically, no development is allowed within the floodway unless an engineering analysis is provided by the applicant to show that any proposed development would not cause any increase in base flood elevation, not even an inch. So that is for mapped and regulated floodways. Sometimes a community has unmapped floodways within your zone AE. Now, typically, your map should distinguish whether or not it's a regulated or a mapped or an unmapped floodway. So in an unmapped floodway, no development is allowed unless the applicant, again, provides an engineering analysis that shows that with combined existing and anticipated development, there will not be an increase in the base flood elevation by more than 1 foot at any point within the community. So the unmapped floodways have a little bit more allowance for development than the mapped floodways. But regardless, both of them are going to require an engineering analysis to show that any change in the base flood elevation. All right, so manufactured homes. These have some other requirements because they're technically movable, but not easily movable. So they have to be elevated on a permanent foundation with the lowest floor at or above the base flood elevation. And they also must be securely anchored to the ground in the foundation. And FEMA has a guidance document on how to protect manufactured homes from floods and other hazards. So recreational vehicles. These can kind of get a little iffy. So RVs are allowed on site as long as it is on location for less than 180 consecutive days, or it has to be fully licensed and ready for highway use. No structures can be attached to the RVs. And if it doesn't meet, like if it is going to be essentially used as a permanent home and it's not ready for highway use, it is going to be considered a manufactured home. And all of the regulations for a manufactured home are going to apply to it in that case. So it would have to be on a foundation and adequately anchored. So communities are allowed to grant variances on the floodplain regulations, although it is not advised. So this is really only used in the instance where you have a development or a building or structure that has to be in a specific location due to its use. For example, if your community prohibits all development within the floodway or floodplain, but you want to put in, or the community is trying to put in a public access boat ramp, that the dredging and paving and fill likely would need to be granted a variance in that situation. And granting variances is a local decision. It must be based on 3 NFIP variance criteria, which is spelled out in this FEMA bulletin, and 5 state variance criteria. If your community does issue a variance, document it. Document the reasoning behind the variance, because it is your community's only protection if this development causes flood damage. All right, so I know that was a lot, and this training was really just to try to give people an introduction to all of the various aspects that go along with the National Flood Insurance Program. So some of the key takeaways from today are to become familiar with your community's floodplain maps and flood insurance study report, know how to make a base flood elevation determination, or at least know where you can look it up. And then also check out the Map Service Center, the Flood Map Changes Viewer, participate in and stay informed of any FEMA mapping projects that are happening in your community. Also have an effective permit and enforcement process that is documented for all development in your special flood hazard area. Develop administrative procedures and to ensure adherence, consistency, and maintain good standing within the NFIP. Also, you want to make sure that you are understanding your own community's floodplain regulations and whether or not your community has higher standards. Also get familiar with the guidance and resources available. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me or at the New Hampshire Office of Planning and Development. And for more information, we have some resource documents and guides on our website. We also have a quarterly newsletter and a YouTube channel. The YouTube channel will have recordings of other old trainings such as this one. And then we also have some more trainings coming this spring. Yeah, so at this point, I am going to, well, first off, here's my contact information and also Stephanie's contact information. Both you can reach out to both of us for any questions regarding the NFIP. But now I am going to give people a chance for asking questions. And you can either raise your hand, unmute yourself. I also see in chat, you can type it in chat. So I'm just going to get started. So someone asked, what is the general price range for New Hampshire homes that have national flood insurance or looking to get it? Where can you find this information? So unfortunately, that question is asking for private information. So FEMA is very conservative with what information they're going to share on the essential or essentially like how many and which properties are and have flood insurance, just due to could be discrimination reasons. But yeah, that's part of the privacy information. I don't even have access to that data, unfortunately. But if you are a community that is looking for that information, FEMA I would email me and I can send you the email address that FEMA has for those kind of questions, but you will likely need an information sharing access agreement through FEMA. And so I would check with your community to see if your community does have one. If not, it might be a good idea to get one set up with FEMA. All right, so someone asked, please say more about highest adjacent grade and how to determine it and its relevance. So highest adjacent grade is an engineering and a surveying term. I am not an engineering background, so like I can only say a little bit about it. It is all right, so you have the ground, and then you have your house that's built on it. And the highest adjacent grade would be the highest elevation of that ground next to your house. And then you're going to use that as essentially like the floor of, so yeah, your highest adjacent grade is the highest ground next to your house. And then for determining how high your first floor is going to be, you're going to need to go 1 foot above that. And then that is the minimum requirement for the lowest floor elevation. I hope that answers your question. All right. Does anybody have any more questions? You can unmute or raise your hand. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any at the moment, so I encourage everybody to check out our YouTube page. Can we get publications with this information? So FEMA has an online publications resource, uh, and there I don't know the exact URL for it right now, but it is something that you can look up. But I don't think that there's a compiled list, or that, at least not that I'm aware of at the moment, of all of these guidance documents. But I will be sending you guys these slides afterwards, and any of the guidance documents that I had shown, they are very easy to look up. Just type them into Google or Edge or whichever search engine you use, and you should be able to find that. Also, on our resources section of our floodplain website that we have at the Office of Planning and Development, we have a lot of these FEMA publications linked there as well. It's not a comprehensive list, but it's at least the most often used and requested references. All right. Well, I'm going to wrap us up there. Thank you, everybody, for coming to this training. If any of you were looking for, if any of you are working on getting a certified floodplain manager certificate and we're hoping to get credit from this class, just email me after the fact, and I can get you the materials to get credit for this training. And that's really only if you're looking for getting a certified floodplain manager certificate. All right, well, thank you, everybody. Please feel free to email me with any questions, and I hope you have a warm Tuesday. Bye.